his foreign policy speech Thursday afternoon, President Obama warned that domestic terrorism would increase in the modern age of the Internet. This threat is not new, Obama said, but technology and the Internet increases its frequency and lethality. Obama warned Americans that materials on the Internet could influence people to commit terrorist acts. Today, a person can consume hateful propaganda, commit themselves to a violent agenda, and learn how to kill without leaving their home, he said.
To the criticism about drone strikes, both here at home and abroad, understandably centers on reports of civilian casualties. There's a wide gap between U.S. assessments of such casualties and non-governmental reports. Nevertheless, it is a hard fact that U.S. strikes have resulted in civilian casualties, a risk that exists in every war.
The problem is, Barry, that this is not a war. There is no war. We are not at war with Iraq any longer, and we are not at war with Afghanistan. True, the Congress gave authorization for military combat, but they were lied to about the weapons of mass destruction. And the war on terror, they want to make it a global war that you can't define an enemy. They say Al-Qaeda, they say the Taliban. They'll come up with a new one when those get dry. There is no war. Period. The war on terror is a fraud. We create the angry, hateful response of the Muslim people that are oppressed. And they strike back. And I swear, as God is my witness, I will continue to reveal the truth. And I know by just simply doing this, I will be called a terrorist. One day, I will be called a terrorist. After all, I'm co-founder of We Are Change Connecticut. Chris Matthews said we're a hate group. Do you think what I do is hateful? I sure don't. Do you think what our government has done to the people and taken the wealth and stolen and in the back pocket of all the bankers, stolen all the wealth of the American people? How many people have lost their homes? Millions of people? 20 million people lost their homes? That they focus on that were uninsured now have coverage because it's forced by the government? But 70 million people are on the government dime. 27 million people are on welfare. Food stamps. A total of 70 million Americans are on some form of public assistance. And then you put in Obamacare? A tax that'll make businesses shed their employees so they don't have to pay the tax and they don't have to, and because they can't afford to give them insurance. It's an insidious plot to destroy our nation. Research Norman Dodd. In fact,
Mr. Dodd,
here
let's
he
begin
is.
this interview by a brief statement telling us who you are, what your background is, and your qualifications to speak on this subject.
Well, Mr. Griffin, as for who I am just, as the name implies, an individual born in New Jersey and educated in private schools, eventually in a school called Andover, Massachusetts, and then Yale University, and running through my whole period of being brought up and growing up, I have been an indefatigable reader, and I have had one major interest, and that was this country, as I was led to believe it was originally founded. And I entered the world of business knowing absolutely nothing about how that world operated, and realized that the only way to find out what that world consisted of would be to become part of it. Norm, you go find out. And I really was fool enough to accept that assignment, because it meant that you were going out to search for something and nobody could tell you what you were looking for. But I felt so strongly on the subject that I consented to. I was relieved of all normal duties inside the bank. And 2.5 years later, I felt that it was possible to report back to those who had given me this assignment. And so I rendered such a report. And as a result of the report I rendered, I was told the following: Norm, what you're saying is we should return to sound banking. And I said, yes, in essence, that's exactly what I'm saying. Whereupon I got my first shock, which was a statement from them to this effect: we will never see sound banking in the United States again. And they cited chapter and verse to support that statement. And what they cited was as follows: since the end of World War I, we have been responsible for what they call the institutionalizing of conflicting interests. And they are so prevalent inside this country that they can never be resolved. This came to me as an extraordinary shock, because the men who made the statement were men who were deemed as the most prominent bankers in the country. The bank of which I was a part was spoken of as a Morgan bank. And coming from men of that caliber, a statement of that kind made a tremendous impression on me. And the type of impression that it made on me was, I wondered if I, as an individual and it's what they call a junior officer of the bank, could, with the same enthusiasm, foster the progress and the policies of the bank. I spent about a year trying to think this out, and came to the conclusion that I would have to resign. I did resign, and as a consequence of that, had this experience. When my letter of resignation reached the desk of the president of the bank, he sent for me. And then I came to visit with him, and he stated to me, Norm, I have your letter, but I don't believe you understand what's happened in the last 10 days. And I said, no, Mr. Cochran, I have no idea what's happened. Well, he said, the directors have never been able to get your report to them out of their mind. And as a result, they have decided that you, as an individual, must begin at once, and you must reorganize this bank in keeping with your own ideas. And he then said, now, can I tear up your letter? And inasmuch as what had been said to me was offering me, at the age of, by then, 33, about as fine an opportunity for service to the country as I could imagine, I said yes. And they said they wished me to begin at once. And I did, and suddenly, in the span of about 6 weeks, I was not permitted to do another piece of work. And every time I brought the subject up, I was kind of patted on the back and said, and told, stop worrying about it, Norm. Pretty soon you'll be a vice president, and then you'll have quite a handsome salary, and ultimately be able to retire on a very worthwhile pension. In the meantime, you can play golf and tennis to your heart's content on weekends. Well, Mr. Griffin, I found I couldn't do it. I spent a year figuratively with my feet on the desk doing nothing, and I just couldn't adjust to it. So I did resign. And this time, my resignation stuck, and then I got my second shock, which was the discovery that the doors of every bank in the United States were closed to me, and I never could get a job, as it were, in a bank.
At what point in your career did you become connected with the Reese Committee?
1953.
1953.
Yeah.
And what was that capacity, sir?
That was the capacity of what they call Director of Research for the Reese Committee.
Can you tell us what the Reese Committee was attempting to do?
Yes, I can tell you. It was operating and carrying out instructions embodied in a resolution passed by the House of Representatives, which was to investigate the activities of foundations as to whether or not these activities could justifiably be labeled un-American, without, I might say, defining what they meant by un-American. But that was the resolution, and the committee had then the task of selecting a council, and the council in turn had the task of selecting a staff, and he had to have somebody who would direct the work of that staff. In that report, I specifically, number one, defined what was, to us, what was meant by the phrase un-American, and we defined that in our way as being a determination to effect changes in the country by unconstitutional means.
For the families of those civilians, no words or legal construct can justify their loss. For me and those in my chain of command, those deaths will haunt us as long as we live. Just as we are haunted by the civilian casualties that have occurred throughout conventional fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. But as Commander-in-Chief, I must weigh these heartbreaking tragedies against the alternatives. To do nothing in the face of terrorist networks would invite far more civilian casualties, not just in our cities at home and our facilities abroad, but also in the very places like Sana'a and Kabul and Mogadishu, where terrorists seek a foothold. Remember that the terrorists we are after target civilians, and the death toll from their acts of terrorism against Muslims dwarfs
figures we have
any
obtained
estimate
from the executive branch
civilian casualties from
confirm
drone
that the
strikes.
number of civilian casualties
Nisar Khan
has typically been in the single digits. Told you can't.
Orphans.
That what we had
Because it's
uncovered was the
classified.
determination
Well, I
of
think
these
that
large
rationale
endowed
is long
foundations
gone.
through their trustees to actually get control of education.
There's quite a bit.
Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is? And I said, yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, Mr. Dodd, we are here operate on similar, in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, of course, legally you're entitled to make grants for this purpose, but I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you told me? And his answer was, we would not think of doing any such thing. So then I said, well, Mr. Gaither, obviously you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you just told me.